The first snowflake landed on Sarah's cheek like a kiss, and I watched her laugh in that way that still made my heart skip after 12 years of marriage. Ahead of us, Mark and Jennifer trudged up the winding path toward the cabin, their breath creating miniature clouds in the crisp mountain air. Mark turned back, flashing that infectious grin I'd known since college. "Last one up buys the first round," he called out, quickening his pace. I squeezed Sarah's gloved hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her fingers through the fabric. "What do you say, love? Should we show them how it's done?" She smiled, but something flickered in her eyes, so brief I might have imagined it. "Race you," she whispered, releasing my hand and darting ahead. The cabin emerged through the snow-laden pines like a postcard come to life. Weathered logs, smoke curling from the stone chimney, windows glowing amber against the gathering dusk. We'd spent months planning this getaway, coordinating schedules and trading excited messages about hiking trails and evening plans. A week away from deadlines and devices, just the four of us reconnecting like we used to before careers and mortgages had begun to overshadow our friendship. Mark reached the cabin first, dramatically throwing himself against the door. "Victory!" he proclaimed, pulling Jennifer close and planting a theatrical kiss on her temple. She rolled her eyes but leaned into him, their easy affection a mirror of what Sarah and I had always shared. Inside, the cabin exceeded the photos from the rental listing. Exposed beams stretched overhead, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the great room. The furniture was all leather and pine, with thick wool blankets draped over the backs of chairs. Large windows offered sweeping views of the valley below and the peaks beyond, though clouds were already beginning to gather, heavy with the promise of snow. "This is perfect," Sarah breathed, running her hand along the rough-hewn dining table. "Absolutely perfect." I moved to wrap my arms around her from behind, a gesture as natural as breathing, but she stepped away, busying herself with unpacking. The movement seemed casual enough, but something in it left a hollow feeling in my chest. Before I could dwell on it, Mark emerged from checking out the bedrooms. "Master Suite's got a view that'll knock your socks off," he announced. "Though I'd keep those socks on, forecast says we're in for a big one tonight." Jennifer was already arranging bottles on the kitchen counter. "Which means we should get the important things sorted first." She held up a bottle of whiskey. "Who's starting the fire?" The evening unfolded exactly as I'd imagined during all those months of planning, glasses clinking, stories flowing, laughter echoing off the wooden walls. But as the storm intensified outside, transforming the windows into swirling walls of white, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was brewing, something in the way Sarah's laugh seemed to linger too long at Mark's jokes, or how Jennifer's smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she refilled our glasses. "Remember that camping trip in Yosemite?" Mark was saying, firelight dancing across his face. "When that bear..." Thunder cracked overhead, startling us all. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged us into darkness. In the sudden quiet, I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, followed by Mark's low chuckle. "Perfect timing for ghost stories," he joked, his voice coming from somewhere to my left. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, and in that brief moment before I found it, I heard the softest whisper, barely audible above the howling wind. I couldn't make out the words, but something in its tone made my skin prickle. When light flooded the room seconds later, everyone was exactly where they had been, wearing expressions of mild alarm that slowly melted into nervous laughter. But something had shifted, subtle as a change in barometric pressure before a storm. I looked at Sarah, her face half-shadowed in the phone's harsh light, and for the first time in our marriage, I couldn't read her expression at all. "I'll check the circuit breaker," I offered, already moving toward the basement door. As I descended the stairs, the thunder rolled again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed some invisible threshold. That this week in the mountains would change everything, I just didn't know how yet. Morning arrived with deceptive gentleness, sunlight gleaming off fresh snow that had transformed the landscape into something alien and pristine. I woke to find Sarah's side of the bed already cold, the sheets bearing only the ghost of her presence. The silence in our room felt heavy, like another blanket I couldn't shake off. Downstairs, I found her and Mark in the kitchen, heads bent close over steaming coffee mugs. They straightened as I entered, their laughter cutting off abruptly. Something about their posture, the way they leaned slightly away from each other, too carefully casual, sent a ripple of unease through my stomach. Early birds plotting without me? I tried to keep my tone light, reaching for the coffee pot. Just comparing hiking routes, Sarah said, sliding a map across the counter. Her fingers lingered on the paper a moment too long. Mark thinks we should check out the old mining trails. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, already dressed for hiking. The shadows under her eyes suggested she'd slept as poorly as I had. The ranger's supposed to stop by first, she reminded us. Something about checking permits after the storm. The ranger arrived as we finished breakfast, snow crunching under his heavy boots. Ranger's Connor was younger than I expected, with weather-worn features that suggested he'd aged more from exposure than years. His expression darkened when Mark mentioned the mining trails. Wouldn't recommend those, he said, absently touching a scar that ran along his jaw. We've had incidents. Strange markings appearing on trees, equipment going missing. He paused, eyes scanning our faces. Things that make no sense, even to those of us who know these mountains. Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. You're not serious? Dead serious, ma'am. Connor pulled out his phone, showing us photos of bizarre symbols carved into tree trunks and rocks. They looked ancient, yet the cuts appeared fresh. These showed up last week. Nobody's claiming responsibility. We set out anyway, following a different trail that Connor had marked as safe. The snow made everything quieter, our footsteps muffled in the thick white blanket. Mark took the lead, with Sarah close behind. I found myself walking beside Jennifer, watching our spouses' backs as they navigated the narrow path. They seemed close today, Jennifer said softly, her words forming small clouds in the cold air. The neutrality in her voice felt studied, as if she were trying too hard to sound casual. They've always been good friends, I replied, but the words tasted strange on my tongue. We came upon the first marking an hour into our hike, a deep gash in a massive pine, the symbol similar to those in Connor's photos but somehow more disturbing in person. The cut looked fresh, sap still oozing despite the cold. This wasn't here when I checked the trail yesterday, Connor had said. The implication hung in the air like frost. Mark reached out to touch the marking, and Sarah grabbed his wrist. Their hands stayed connected a heartbeat longer than necessary before dropping away. Jennifer inhaled sharply beside me, and when I turned to look at her, her eyes were fixed on their hands, her expression unreadable. We found more markings as we continued, each one more elaborate than the last. They formed a pattern that seemed to lead us deeper into the woods, away from the main trail. The temperature dropped steadily, and the sun disappeared behind gathering clouds. We should head back, Jennifer suggested, hugging herself against the cold. Something doesn't feel right. As if in response, a branch cracked somewhere in the woods, too heavy to be small wildlife. We all froze, listening. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Probably just deer, Mark said, but he moved closer to Sarah as he spoke. I watched his hand brush the small of her back, a gesture so subtle it could have been accidental. Sarah didn't move away. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind. Sarah's breathing beside me was too measured to be genuine sleep. Through the wall, I could hear murmured voices from Mark and Jennifer's room, their words indistinct but their tones sharp with tension. I thought about the markings in the woods, how they seemed to be leading somewhere. About the way Sarah and Mark had walked just slightly ahead of us all day, their heads bent together in private conversation. About Jennifer's careful silence, and the weight of unspoken words hanging between us all. The wind carried a sound like laughter, or maybe crying, from somewhere in the darkness outside. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal, real or imagined. But as I finally drifted towards sleep, I realized the true horror might not be in the wilderness around us, but in the growing distance between heartbeats sharing the same bed. The frozen lake stretched before us like shattered mercury, its surface fractured by winter's relentless grip. Sarah stood at the edge, her breath creating delicate clouds that dissolved into nothing. Behind her, Mark adjusted his pack with practiced efficiency, their shadows nearly touching on the pristine snow. "The ranger said it should be stable enough to cross," Mark announced, though something in his voice suggested uncertainty. His eyes met Sarah's briefly, a look that lasted a fraction too long, carried weight I couldn't quite understand. Jennifer hung back, her boots crunching in the fresh powder as she shifted nervously. "Maybe we should stick to the short trail. Where's your sense of adventure?" Sarah teased, but the lightness in her voice felt forced, like she was performing for an audience I couldn't see. The ice began thick and solid near the shore, but as we ventured further, tiny fissures spiderwebbed beneath our feet. Each step brought a symphony of subtle creaks and groans, nature's warning system. I found myself counting the seconds between Sarah's steps and Mark's, noting how they fell into an unconscious rhythm together. The first crack came without warning. Jennifer's scream pierced the winter silence as the ice shifted beneath her feet. I moved without thinking, my body responding before my mind could process the danger. My hands found her jacket, pulling her back just as a section of ice gave way, revealing the dark water beneath. She collapsed against me, trembling. Her weight, her fear, her racing heartbeat, everything felt startlingly intimate. For a moment, we were simply two people clinging to each other in the face of mortality, all pretense stripped away. "Jen!" Mark's voice cracked with genuine fear, but his feet carried him towards Sarah first, an instinctive movement he seemed to realize too late. He corrected his course, reaching us in 3 long strides. Sarah stood frozen in place, her face a mask I couldn't read. "Is she okay?" Jennifer's fingers dug into my coat as she steadied herself. "I'm fine," she managed, but didn't immediately pull away. Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, or a shared recognition of something we weren't ready to name. "We should head back," I suggested, still supporting Jennifer's weight. "The ice isn't as stable as we thought." The return journey felt longer, heavier with unspoken words. Mark walked beside Jennifer now, his hand hovering near her elbow, but his attention seemed divided. Every few steps, his gaze would drift to Sarah, who had taken the lead, her posture rigid with what might have been concern, or guilt. That evening, I found Jennifer alone on the cabin's back deck, staring at the lake that had nearly claimed her. The sunset painted everything in shades of purple and gold, making even dangerous things look beautiful. "Thank you," she said quietly as I joined her. "For today. Anyone would have done the same." She turned to look at me, her eyes reflecting the dying light. "No, they wouldn't have." Her voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass more than just the day's events. Some people move toward what they want, regardless of who might get hurt in the process." The words hung between us like frost in the air. Inside the cabin, I could hear Sarah's laughter mingling with Mark's, the sound drifting through the walls like smoke. "How long have you known?" I asked, the question emerging before I could stop it. Jennifer's smile was sad, knowing. "Sometimes we see things most clearly when we're falling." She reached out and squeezed my hand briefly, her touch saying everything her words couldn't. I stayed on the deck long after she went inside, watching darkness claim the lake. In the distance, the ice continued to crack, a slow, inevitable process of breaking that seemed to echo something deeper, more personal. Some part of me understood that we were all on thin ice now, and the surface beneath our feet was growing weaker by the hour. Through the cabin window, I caught a glimpse of Sarah's reflection as she moved through the kitchen. For a moment, she looked like a stranger, and I wondered if that's what happens to love, if it doesn't die suddenly, but transforms slowly, like water turning to ice, until what remains is just a frozen version of what used to flow freely between two hearts. We found the old hunting lodge just as the afternoon light began to fade. It emerged from the forest like a memory better left forgotten, weathered boards the color of old bones, windows dark and watching. A rusted chain hung broken across the entrance, swaying slightly though there was no wind. "This must be the place Connor mentioned," Mark said, his voice carrying an edge of excitement that seemed at odds with the lodge's foreboding presence. Said it's been abandoned since the 70s. Sarah stepped forward, snow crunching beneath her boots. The sound seemed too loud in the unnatural silence that surrounded the building. We shouldn't, she said, but her feet carried her toward the entrance anyway. Mark followed, their bodies casting a single shadow in the dying light. Jennifer's hand found mine in the gathering darkness, her fingers ice cold. The touch carried echoes of our moment at the frozen lake, that unspoken understanding growing stronger with each passing hour. We watched our spouses disappear into the lodge's maw, their eagerness to explore together feeling like another small betrayal. Inside, our flashlight beams carved yellow paths through decades of dust. The air hung thick with the musty breath of abandonment, and something else, a metallic tang that made my throat tighten. Old furniture loomed beneath white sheets, like ghosts frozen in mid-conversation. Look at this, Sarah called out, her voice unnaturally bright as she pulled a sheet from what appeared to be a guest registry. The leather-bound book fell open, releasing the scent of decay. Pages filled with faded signatures told stories of hunters and hikers seeking refuge, until the entries stopped abruptly in November 1978. The final entry caught my eye. Something's wrong here. The others don't see it yet, but I do. Trust is such a fragile thing. The rest was illegible, lost to water damage and time. Mark leaned over Sarah's shoulder to read, his chest pressing against her back in a way that seemed unconsciously intimate. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly on the page. Jennifer turned away, her profile sharp with shadow and something that might have been pain. We moved deeper into the lodge, finding remnants of lives interrupted, coffee cups still on tables, jackets hung by the door as if their owners had stepped out momentarily. In what must have been the main gathering room, a half-played chess game sat frozen in time, pieces positioned in what looked like the final moves of a losing battle. Why would they just leave everything? Jennifer wondered aloud, her voice barely a whisper. The answer came in the form of old newspaper clippings we found pressed between the pages of a Bible, yellow with age but still readable. Headlines spoke of disappearances, of tensions between couples who had sought refuge here, of betrayals that ended in tragedy. Sarah's flashlight beam caught a series of photographs tacked to one wall, smiling faces that seemed to darken with each successive image, joy gradually replaced by something harder, more brittle. In the final photo, two couples stood before the lodge, their poses stiff, their smiles forced. The date stamped in the corner matched the last entry in the guest book. A floorboard creaked overhead, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. We all jumped, beams swinging toward the ceiling. Just the building settling, Mark said quickly, but his hand had found Sarah's waist in the darkness. The gesture seemed protective, possessive, and achingly familiar. It was how I used to touch her. Later that night, back in our cabin, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. Sarah's breathing beside me was shallow, pretending at sleep. Through the wall, I could hear low voices, Mark and Sarah's, not Mark and Jennifer's. Their whispers carried through the heating vent, too muffled to make out words but clear enough to recognize the tone of shared secrets. The shadows in our room seemed to move with purpose, gathering in corners like conspirators. I thought about the old lodge, about how easy it is for a place meant for refuge to become a tomb for trust. About how betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunderclaps and lightning, but creeps in like evening shadows, lengthening so gradually you don't notice the darkness until you're surrounded by it. In the distance something howled, wolf or wind, I couldn't tell. But in that moment, I understood what the last guest at the hunting lodge had meant. Something was wrong here, in this perfect cabin in these beautiful mountains. And like that long-ago writer, I could see it now, even if I wasn't ready to name it. The night stretched on, and I watched Sarah's silhouette against the window, wondering if she was dreaming of another man's touch, or if she felt any guilt at all about slowly murdering the history we built together. Outside, the moon cast double shadows through the frost-covered glass, one sharp and clear, the other blurred and distorted, like the difference between the life I thought we had and the reality I was beginning to understand. Evening settled into the cabin like a held breath. The fire traced dancing shadows across our faces as we gathered around the coffee table, cards spread between us like landmines waiting to be triggered. Sarah shuffled the deck with practiced grace, her wedding ring catching the firelight with each fluid movement. "Remember how we used to play this every weekend in grad school?" Mark asked, his voice warm with nostalgia. He sat cross-legged on the floor, closer to Sarah than necessary. "Before life got complicated? Before mortgages and meetings became our religion," I added, watching Sarah's hands. They moved differently now, I realized, more deliberately, as if every gesture carried hidden meaning. Jennifer arranged her cards with methodical precision, her fingers trembling slightly. I recognized the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone bracing for impact. The same posture I'd begun to adopt without realizing it. The game started innocently enough. Hearts and clubs, diamonds and spades, each card revealed small stories written in the player's reactions. But as wine glasses emptied and refilled, the atmosphere shifted. Playful jabs gained razor edges, jokes carried double meanings. "Your tell is showing," Mark teased Sarah after she played a particularly aggressive hand. His words seemed to caress her name, and something intimate flickered between them, a shared secret dancing in their pupils. "Some of us are better at hiding things than others," Jennifer responded, her voice artificially light. The words hung in the air like smoke, making Sarah's next shuffle falter almost imperceptibly. I laid down a queen of hearts, remembering how Sarah used to say it was her card, the one that always reminded her of our first date. Now she barely glanced at it before covering it with a king from her hand. "Mark's king. Interesting play," I commented, studying her face. "Sacrificing the queen to save the king?" Sarah's eyes met mine for the first time in what felt like hours. Something vulnerable flashed across her features before being replaced by a carefully constructed mask. "Sometimes the obvious play isn't the right one," she replied, her words carrying weight far beyond the game. The evening unraveled like a sweater caught on a nail, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Each round brought new tensions to the surface. Mark's hand brushed Sarah's as they reached for cards simultaneously, lingering a moment too long. Jennifer's laugh grew increasingly brittle, like ice about to crack. "Remember that night in Cabo?" Mark asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "When we stayed up until sunrise playing cards on the beach?" "That wasn't Cabo," Jennifer corrected quietly. "That was our honeymoon in Maui." The silence that followed felt like a confession. Sarah stood abruptly, cards scattering across the table. "I need some air," she announced, heading for the deck. Mark waited exactly 3 minutes before following her. I counted every second, each tick of the clock another small betrayal. Jennifer and I sat in the aftermath, gathering fallen cards like broken pieces of ourselves. Through the window, I could see Sarah and Mark's silhouettes merging against the starlit sky. Their voices carried through the glass, too low to distinguish words but intimate enough to twist something deep in my chest. "Do you ever wonder," Jennifer asked softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the Queen of Hearts, "if love is just an elaborate game of deception, where we all pretend not to see each other's tells until the pretense becomes unbearable?" I watched as outside, Sarah reached up to brush something from Mark's cheek, snow, or maybe a tear. The gesture was achingly tender, filled with the kind of casual intimacy that only comes from crossing lines that can never be uncrossed. "Maybe," I replied, gathering the last of the scattered cards. "The real deception is believing we ever had a choice in the game we're playing." That night, Sarah came to bed smelling of winter air and whispered secrets. When she reached for me in the darkness, her touch felt like an apology she couldn't bring herself to voice. I pretended to be asleep, wondering if she could feel the salt of silent tears on my pillow, if she even cared enough to notice anymore. Dawn painted the snow in shades of rose gold when we found the first tracks. They emerged from the tree line like dark accusations pressed into the pristine white, massive paw prints that made my chest tighten with primitive fear. But it wasn't their size that disturbed me most, it was their pattern. They circled our cabin in an ever-tightening spiral, as if something had been watching us, studying our movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah knelt beside one of the prints, her breath creating delicate clouds in the morning air. "Mountain lion," she whispered, her expertise from years of wildlife photography evident in her voice. A large one. Mark crouched next to her, his shoulder brushing hers with familiar ease. Fresh, too. Can't be more than a few hours old. His hand found the small of her back, a gesture I used to think of as friendly. Now it felt like watching someone trace their name on something that belonged to me. Jennifer stood slightly apart, arms wrapped around herself against more than just the cold. Her eyes met mine, carrying that same knowing sadness I'd seen at the frozen lake. We'd become unwitting allies in this slow-motion collapse of our lives, sharing silent understanding of wounds too fresh to name. We should follow them, Mark suggested, already stepping toward the tree line. Figure out where it's denning. That's exactly what we shouldn't do, I countered, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. Tracking a predator that's clearly tracking us? That's how people end up as cautionary tales. Sarah straightened, brushing snow from her knees. He's right, Mark. We should call Connor, let him know what we found. But even as she spoke, she was moving to follow Mark, drawn into his orbit like a planet that had forgotten its original sun. We spent the morning tracking the beast's path, finding more evidence of its surveillance, scratch marks on trees, tufts of fur caught on branches, and most disturbingly, a half-eaten deer carcass that seemed deliberately placed where our hiking trail met the forest edge. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation. The tracks led us through increasingly dense forests before circling back toward our cabin. With each step, the tension between us grew thicker than the mountain air. I watched Sarah and Mark navigate the terrain ahead, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of more than just friendship. They flowed around obstacles like water finding its natural course, while Jennifer and I followed like shadows they'd forgotten they cast. Sometimes, Jennifer murmured, soft enough that only I could hear, I think we're not tracking one predator, but living with two. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. How long had we been playing the prey in this other, more intimate hunt? As evening approached, we returned to find the cabin darker than we'd left it, though nothing had visibly changed. Inside, Sarah busied herself with dinner preparation while Mark built a fire, their domestic choreography too perfect, too practiced. Jennifer disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone with the weight of unspoken words and growing certainty. Night fell like a funeral shroud. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling, or perhaps something else moving in the darkness. Through the wall, I heard the quiet click of a door, followed by footsteps too careful to be innocent. Sarah's side of the bed was empty, cooling rapidly in the mountain air. I rose, drawn to the window by movement in the yard. The moon cast enough light to see fresh tracks in the snow, not the mountain lions this time, but human. Two sets, moving together toward the old hunting lodge we'd discovered days earlier. In that moment, I understood with crushing clarity. We had been so focused on the predator outside that we'd missed the one living among us, wearing the face of love while hunting trust to extinction. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, supposedly safe in our cabin while a deadly predator stalked the perimeter, yet the real danger had always been inside with us. The mountain lion's tracks were just honest footprints in snow. It was the invisible tracks of betrayal that would leave the deeper scars. I remained at the window long after the footprints were obscured by fresh snowfall, wondering which was more dangerous, the beasts that hunted with honest hunger, or the ones who stalked with smiles and sweet lies, leaving hearts instead of carcasses in their wake. The morning light filtered through frost-etched windows, casting prismatic shadows across Jennifer's face as she stared into her untouched coffee. The silence in the kitchen felt like a living thing, growing denser with each passing moment. Mark hadn't come down for breakfast, either had Sarah. The implications of their simultaneous absence hung in the air like smoke. When Jennifer finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. I found receipts, she said, fingers trembling around her mug. Dinner reservations. Hotel charges. All from times he said he was working late. Each word seemed to cost her something vital, as if speaking the truth aloud was draining her life force. I watched a tear trace its way down her cheek, remembering how Sarah had started keeping her phone face down, password changed from our anniversary date to something I didn't know. The parallel made my chest ache. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my response. Mark appeared first, then Sarah moments later, both looking too carefully composed, like actors entering a stage. The meaningful glance they shared lasted less than a second, but Jennifer caught it. I saw the impact in the way her shoulders stiffened. Sleep well? Jennifer's question carried a blade's edge beneath its innocent surface. Mark reached for the coffee pot, his movements deliberately casual. Fine. Why? Interesting. Jennifer's laugh held no humor. Considering you weren't in our bed when I woke at 3 a.m. The coffee pot slipped in Mark's grip, dark liquid splashing across the counter. Sarah moved to help clean it up, an instinctive gesture that proved too revealing. Their hands met over the spilled coffee, withdrawing too quickly when they realized we were watching. I couldn't sleep, Mark said finally. Went for a walk. In the middle of the night? Jennifer's voice rose slightly. With no coat? No boots by the door? Each question landed like a blow. Or maybe you didn't need them, since you never went outside at all. Sarah busied herself with the paper towels, her face carefully blank. But I noticed how her hands shook, how she wouldn't meet my eyes. Jen, you're being paranoid. Mark attempted, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Am I? Jennifer stood so abruptly her chair scraped across the floor. Tell me about the Riverside Hotel, Mark. About the business dinner last month that cost $300 and included a room charge. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Sarah's face drain of color, her throat working as she swallowed whatever words she might have said. You went through my credit card statements? Mark's anger seemed manufactured, a shield against truth rather than genuine outrage. I went looking for answers, Jennifer countered, her voice breaking. Because my husband stopped looking at me the way he used to. Because every time your phone buzzes, you leave the room to answer it. Because... She choked on the words, tears finally spilling over. Because I can smell her perfume on your clothes, and it's killing me pretending I don't. Sarah's sharp intake of breath might as well have been a confession. The paper towels in her hands were shredded to pieces, a physical manifestation of what was happening to our marriages. Jennifer. Mark started, but she cut him off. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Her words came faster now, years of suspicion crystallizing into certainty. You think I haven't seen how you look at her? How you find excuses to touch her? How you both disappear at the same time and come back thinking we won't notice? The room temperature seemed to drop with each accusation. I stood frozen, watching my wife's face as Jennifer's words stripped away the last pretense of innocence. Sarah's eyes were wide, guilty, trapped, like an animal finally cornered after a long chase. I can't do this anymore, Jennifer whispered, and the defeat in her voice was somehow worse than her anger. She turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. The worst part isn't even the betrayal, Mark. It's that you made me doubt myself for so long. Made me feel crazy for seeing what was right in front of me. She left, and the silence that followed was absolute. Mark stared after her, conflict written across his features. But his eyes drifted to Sarah, seeking connection even now, even in the ruins of what they'd destroyed. I watched my wife watch my best friend, saw the silent communication pass between them, and understood with crushing finality that some storms leave nothing standing in their wake. The quiet that descended wasn't peace, it was the eye of a hurricane, and we were all about to be torn apart by what came next. The mountain air burned in my lungs as I made my way back to the cabin, cutting my solo hike short as storm clouds gathered overhead. Each step crunched in the snow with a finality that seemed prophetic, as if nature itself was marking time between my last moments of ignorance and the truth that waited ahead. I'd left that morning seeking clarity, hoping the solitude would help me process Jennifer's confrontation with Mark. But the mountains offered no answers, only the hollow echo of questions I wasn't ready to face. The weight of Sarah's wedding ring in my pocket, found abandoned by the bathroom's sink, felt like a small bomb waiting to detonate. The cabin emerged through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney in lazy spirals. From outside, it looked like a postcard of domestic tranquility. But appearances, I'd learned, were just another form of betrayal. I didn't slam the door. Didn't stomp my boots or announce my presence. Some instinct, born perhaps from weeks of growing suspicion, made me move quietly. The kind of quiet that truth requires to finally surface. Their voices drifted down from upstairs, intimate murmurs punctuated by soft laughter. Sarah's laugh, but not the one I knew. This was her private laugh, the one that used to be reserved for our early morning moments, for secrets shared in the dark. Now it belonged to someone else. My feet carried me up the stairs as if in a dream. Each step felt simultaneously too fast and too slow, time stretching like taffy around this moment I couldn't stop myself from walking into. The door to the master bedroom stood slightly ajar, winter light spilling through the gap like a spotlight on a stage I never wanted to see. They didn't hear me. Didn't see me. They were lost in their own world, a world built on the ruins of 2 marriages. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, Mark standing between her knees, his fingers tangled in her hair. The intimacy of the scene felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah was saying, but her hands betrayed her words, pulling him closer. "It's destroying them." Mark's response was lost in the roaring in my ears as 12 years of marriage crystallized into this single, shattering moment. I watched my best friend kiss my wife with the familiarity of long practice, saw her respond with a passion I'd thought was still mine. The wedding ring felt molten in my pocket. "How long?" My voice surprised all of us. They sprang apart like guilty teenagers, but there was nothing childish about the calculated looks that crossed their faces, the quick, silent communication between practiced conspirators. "David." Sarah stood, smoothing her shirt with trembling hands. "You're back early. How long?" Mark stepped forward, arms raised as if to ward off a physical attack. "Listen, man. Don't." The word came out sharp enough to make them both flinch. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. Just tell me how long you've been making fools of us." The silence stretched, filled with the weight of uncounted lies. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. Jennifer stood in the hallway, her face a mirror of the devastation I felt. She'd known, of course she'd known. We'd both known. But knowing and seeing were entirely different wounds. 6 months, Sarah finally whispered. "Maybe more. It just happened." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, surprising in its bitterness. "Just happened? Like gravity? Like weather?" Each word tasted like poison. "Did you just happen to forget our vows? Did you just happen to decide that 15 years of friendship meant nothing?" "We never meant..." Mark started, but Jennifer's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Never meant what, Mark? To get caught? To hurt us? Or did you just never mean for us to matter at all?" The truth hung between us like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Outside, the gathering storm finally broke, rain lashing against the windows with a violence that matched the tempest in my chest. Thunder rolled across the mountains, nature's accompaniment to the sound of 2 marriages shattering beyond repair. Sarah took a step toward me, tears streaming down her face. "David, please. Don't." I pulled her ring from my pocket, let it fall to the floor where it rolled to a stop at her feet. The soft ping of metal on wood seemed to echo forever. "Your aim's getting worse, by the way. Next time you take off your wedding ring to be with my best friend, try not to leave it where I can find it." The storm raged outside, but in that room, in that moment, a different kind of darkness fell. The kind that comes when you finally see the truth about the people you loved most, and realize that love itself had been the first casualty in a war you didn't even know you were fighting. The aftermath of revelation settled over the cabin like nuclear winter. Silence filled every room, broken only by the persistent howl of mountain winds that seemed to mock our collective grief. I found myself in the kitchen, mechanically washing the morning's coffee cups, artifacts from when we were still pretending at normalcy. My hands shook as I lifted Sarah's favorite mug, the one I'd given her on our 10th anniversary. The urge to shatter it against the wall was almost overwhelming. Jennifer sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing patterns in spilled sugar. Neither of us had spoken since the confrontation upstairs. What was there to say when your whole world implodes? How do you find words for the specific agony of watching the two people you trusted most destroy everything you believed in? I kept his dental appointment card on our fridge, Jennifer said suddenly, her voice hollow. Next Thursday at 2. I've been reminding him about it all week. She laughed, the sound sharp and wounded. Isn't that absurd? I'm still trying to take care of him, while he's upstairs packing to leave with your wife. The mug slipped from my grasp, splashing soapy water across my shirt. The mundane horror of her words hit me like a physical blow. Of course they were packing. Of course they were leaving. That's what people do when they're caught, they run. Footsteps on the stairs made us both flinch. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face tear-stained but composed. She'd always been good at composure, at maintaining appearances. I wondered now how many of her expressions over the years had been carefully constructed lies. David, she started, then stopped, seeing Jennifer. Something like shame flickered across her features. I need to get some things from our room. Our room, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. Tell me something, Sarah. When exactly did it stop being our room? Was it the first time you slept with him, or did you at least have the decency to wait until the second? She recoiled as if I'd struck her. It wasn't like that. We never meant to get caught? Jennifer finished, still staring at the sugar pattern she'd made. To destroy 2 marriages? To make the people who loved you most feel like they're going insane? Her finger stopped moving, having drawn what looked like a broken heart in the crystals. Which part wasn't like that, Sarah? Mark's heavy footsteps preceded his appearance. He carried 2 bags, his and Sarah's, I realized with a wave of nausea. They'd already consolidated their belongings, already planned their escape. How long had they been ready for this moment? We'll get a hotel in town, he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. Until you can figure out how to build your new life on the ashes of ours? The words came out calmer than I felt. How considerate of you both. Sarah moved toward me, hand outstretched. David, please. We need to talk about this. About arrangements, about what? About how you're leaving with my best friend. About how every memory I have of our marriage is now tainted because I don't know when you stopped loving me and started loving him. My voice cracked. Or maybe about how you two will handle Christmas with our families now? Will you take turns? Draw straws for who gets to explain to my mother why her daughter-in-law is suddenly with my best friend. The truth of it, the practical, crushing reality of what came next, seemed to hit Sarah for the first time. She swayed slightly, reaching for the counter to steady herself. Mark moved to support her, an instinctive gesture that made Jennifer's breath catch in a sound like breaking. I did love you, Sarah whispered. I still do, just not. Don't. Jennifer stood so abruptly her chair toppled backward. Don't you dare say you love us while you're walking out that door with each other. Don't pretend this is anything but what it is, a deliberate choice to destroy everything we built together. Outside, snow began to fall, thick, heavy flakes that seemed determined to bury the world. We all watched it for a moment, these 4 people who used to be 2 happy couples, now transformed into something unrecognizable by betrayal. The road will be dangerous soon, Mark said, practical even now. We should go before the weather traps you here with the consequences of your actions? I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped. God forbid you have to spend one more night pretending to be decent human beings. Sarah moved toward the door, then stopped. She turned back, tears falling freely now. I never meant to hurt you. Either of you. I couldn't help how I felt. No, Jennifer said softly, finally looking up from her sugar drawings. But you could have helped what you did about those feelings. You both could have chosen differently. You just didn't want to. The truth of her words seemed to fill the room, making it hard to breathe. Outside, the snow fell harder, nature's curtain drawing closed on the life we'd known. Sarah and Mark gathered their bags, moving toward the door like guilty shadows. I watched my wife leave with my best friend, and wondered if this was how amputation felt: the sharp, clean pain of separation followed by the phantom ache of something vital missing. The mountain made its decision an hour after they left. The storm intensified with theatrical timing, transforming the serene landscape into a maelstrom of white. Through the kitchen window, I watched the world disappear beneath nature's fury, knowing the road down the mountain would already be treacherous. Somewhere out there, Sarah and Mark were trying to escape the consequences of their choices, unaware of the greater danger awaiting them. Jennifer stood beside me, her reflection in the window like a ghost of happiness past. "The ranger called," she said, her voice hollow. "There's been a rock slide on the main road. There." She swallowed hard. "They're trapped between the slide and Miller's Ridge. The same stretch of road where we'd seen the mountain lion tracks." Time stretched like cold honey as we absorbed this information. Part of me, the part still burning with betrayal, wanted to savor the cosmic justice. Let them face the consequences. Let them confront mortality while grappling with their sins. But beneath the anger, something else stirred, the muscle memory of love, worn smooth by years of caring. "We have to help them," Jennifer whispered, though whether to convince me or herself, I couldn't tell. The irony wasn't lost on me, the betrayed rushing to save the betrayers. But she was right. Whatever Sarah and Mark had become, whatever they'd done to us, letting them die on this mountain would destroy something fundamental in ourselves. We found them half a mile down the road, their car hemmed in by fallen rocks on one side and a sheer drop on the other. The snow was falling so heavily it seemed to erase the world beyond our immediate vicinity. Through the whiteout, I saw Sarah's face pressed against the passenger window, eyes wide with relief and something else, shame, perhaps, or the sudden realization that her life might depend on the man she just abandoned. The mountain lion's screech cut through the storm like a blade. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, Mark, attempting to reach our car, slipping on the ice-slicked road. Sarah's scream as he fell, tumbling toward the edge. My body moving before my mind could process, fingers closing around his jacket mere inches from the abyss. The weight of him nearly pulled me over, but Jennifer appeared beside me, her grip steel strong on my belt. Together, we dragged him back from the edge. The mountain lion's cry came again, closer now. Through the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of movement, a shadow darker than the storm, circling with predatory patience. "The car's stuck," Sarah called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "We tried to save it," Jennifer cut her off. "We need to move now." The journey back to the cabin became a blur of white noise and primal fear. Every shadow might have been the mountain lion, every gust of wind its approaching leap. We moved in pairs, Jennifer and Mark, Sarah and me, an arrangement that felt like the universe's cruel joke. The woman I'd built a life with pressed against my side, trembling with cold and fear, while ahead of us, my best friend helped his wife navigate the treacherous path. In the end, we all made it back alive. The cabin's warmth felt surreal after the bone-deep chill of survival. We stood in the living room, dripping snow and avoiding each other's eyes, four people bound by a history we couldn't escape and a future we couldn't face. "Thank you," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "You could have left us out there." "Yes," Jennifer replied simply. "We could have." Sarah moved toward me, her hand lifting as if to touch my arm, then falling away. "David, don't." The word came out softer than I'd intended. "We didn't save you because we forgive you. We saved you because letting you die would have meant becoming something we're not. Something you made us question if we could become." The truth of it hung in the air between us. In choosing to save them, Jennifer and I had also saved something in ourselves, some essential piece of humanity that their betrayal had threatened to destroy. "The ranger says the road won't be cleared until morning," Jennifer announced, her voice carefully neutral. "We should all try to rest." The sleeping arrangements went unspoken. Sarah and Mark took the guest room, while Jennifer and I claimed opposite ends of the living room. As darkness settled over the cabin, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet sounds of four people pretending to sleep while wrestling with the wreckage of their lives. In the end, it wasn't the mountain lion that proved most dangerous, nor the storm that threatened our survival. It was the realization that sometimes the hardest path, the one that requires the most courage, isn't letting go of those who hurt us, but choosing not to become what their betrayal tempts us to be. Morning would come, bringing with it clear skies and the practical matters of divorced lawyers and divided friends. But for now, in the darkness of a cabin surrounded by storm and secrets, for broken people breathed the same air and confronted the truth that survival sometimes means saving those who destroyed you, if only to preserve the best parts of yourself.